All right. So hopefully we can kind of talk through, or hopefully give you a good idea of why space is important. And there's so many different capabilities there: position, navigation, and timing. The global positioning system, GPS, is one of the more common, but it could be environmental monitoring, weather satellites, of course, communication satellites. There's so many other capabilities that are in space and that we rely on. But part of that is, right, let's talk about where we've been though, and kind of what the threats that are out there. First off, one of the things we like to say is that space is both competitive, contested, and congested. And first I would just say, let's talk about congested, right? Going back in time, if you look in the upper right, 1957, right? No satellites up there, no man-made satellites at least. And then we fast forward to 1993, we can see a good number of those little dots around there that represent satellites. And then to 2018, and it's even gotten more congested since then. To give you an idea, right now there's about 7,000 satellites in orbit, right? About 50% of those are active. And that doesn't count small space debris, flecks of paint, other small things. If you've seen the movie Gravity, other movies that you've seen that can do the damage of that, but small little bits that have come off of a rocket body or things like that. There are, a million of those up there, small things. But as far as active satellites, about 7,000. But that's increased about 27% just in the last year. So there's a number of factors there. The cost to launch has really gone down over time, and the use of space is just exploding now, of the possibilities that are out there. SpaceX, right? One of the things now, the Starlink system, it's launching anywhere, 70 to 100 satellites in one rocket launch, right? It's pretty amazing of the smaller size that's come from that. So to give you an idea, about 1,200 satellites were launched just in 2020. So it is becoming more congested up there, right? So that's one of the areas. But then, as like I said, my background's Intel. So really, let's talk about some of the competition that is going on there. And to go back in time, I really started on my military journey right at the very end of the Cold War. But for those of you who remember the Cold War, we saw conflict there. The technology wasn't as advanced as it is today. We knew space was important, but the ability to affect that domain was a little more challenging, right? But we did see co-orbital, when I say ASAT, that's anti-satellite capabilities. But we saw a co-orbital, think of something's on orbit and crash into it, or launching a missile up from the Earth. We saw all of those capabilities before the Soviet Union dissolved. And then we entered a period, right, of not that conflict went away, but it was no longer a bipolar, conflict. But then we have seen a return to, at least related to space, really probably about 2007, right? China, is their rapid military development. We saw that they conducted an ASAT test that unfortunately created a massive amount of debris in orbit. And we've seen this recently on Russian actions in the space domain as well, that call into question what we would want to be the peaceful use of space, but call that into question. So there are a number of competitors, and there's also the chance for unintended consequences to expand into space. So when I say that, what I would tell you is we treated historically space as one of those pristine environments where it would not be militarized, that it was this safe domain. And unfortunately, the actions of other nation states with the ASAT tests from China, Russian actions, have led us to the point now where we must treat it kind of the realist school of thought, right? We must deal with it as it is. And in this case, we needed to focus on this from a military perspective to make sure that we don't lose for a number of reasons in that area. So what I would argue is this is just a continued somewhat nation state conflict or competition, not conflict, but competition, right? So here's just some examples, right? Russia, we can see some unsafe maneuvers against a Navy cruiser in the Philippine Sea, right? So in the maritime domain, we're seeing potential nation state aggression, but definitely dangerous maneuvers in the maritime domain. You go down to the bottom left, It's the same thing in the air domain. In this case, Navy patrol plane EP3, but this case, we've got a Russian aircraft that was an unsafe intercept. And then we also see it in the land domain, right? This is 2020 in Syria, but we've seen some tensions there. Well, this also, unfortunately, it extends into above us into the space domain, right? So this is there's a Russian satellite, Cosmos 2542, that, you know, if you're familiar with the space domain, it's expensive to launch something, much less you normally launch it for a mission, communications, or things like that. In this case, this specific satellite eventually moved into a, I'm going to say stalking position, but shadowing position with one of our intelligence collection satellites, and basically stalked it for a while. I think General Raymond has mentioned that potentially it ejected a smaller microsatellite near this, unsure what this was going on. Bottom line is, this isn't a normal maneuver, and this isn't how you peacefully conduct operations in space. Russia Today did not violate international law, once again, because there's not a lot of laws that extend to space right now. There's not a lot of international agreements that would go on there. But what I would say with this is once again, we're continuing to see an extension of normal nation state activities into space, that it's not a, no pun intended, a vacuum of that, right? Though it is a vacuum. So that's where we're at. So in response to that, like I said, that's one of the reasons Space Force, that's why both the executive and legislative branches have come about to establish a U.S. Space Force as well as a U.S. Space Command. So I've already kind of talked, the video did a much better job than I can to talk about how space is important to our way of life, right? And that's both communications, global, as well as economy, right? Technology, the economy, the economic impacts of this are just exploding, no pun intended. But really, I want to kind of focus on the bottom right? How it impacts our modern way of war. And unfortunately, this is an area where the U.S. has become very reliant on space, and our potential adversaries know that. They recognize our military dependence, and in response, are developing their own space capabilities. And in a conflict, we expect that they will try to degrade our space capabilities because they understand it is such a tremendous advantage that our military has leveraged, GPS, other things over the time. So we expect, they have talked about, right, the intent to be there, and they have the capability to do those things, right? So unfortunately, for the Department of Defense, we must deal with, a nation state that has the intent and has the capability to do us harm. So we have no longer, we must maintain our freedom of action in space, and we need to kind of change our perspective of only thinking about the environmental hazards of space, but now entering the threats that are out there. So how did we get here, right? So going back in time, standing up a Space Corps or a Space Force or things has been talked about, actually since one of the first satellite launches, right? President Reagan talked about that. There were a number of things. If you remember the Star Wars back during the Reagan administration, there was a Space Commission led by Rumsfeld that talked about standing up a Space Corps in the early 2000s. And then recently, there's been a number of congressmen in the legislative branch who have talked about standing up a Space Force or Space Corps. So the idea is not new, but eventually with President Trump establishing that, and now the Biden administration continuing that, like I said, we've had this Space Force, and the intent is to try to prevent us from losing our competitive advantage in space. I won't go into all the middle part of the chart here. Like I said, there's a range of from reversible to non-reversible threats that are out there, whether it could be just attacking a ground station, to jamming or other things out there. But we need to be prepared for that. And I would give the analogy of, if you have no deterrence, right? Well, what prevents someone else from taking advantage of that, right? You don't have locks on your door, or you don't have any of those things. Well, people might break into your house, right? At least having those capabilities and knowledge on those things, hopefully deters conflict. So with U.S. Space Force, right? That's the intent, is to elevate space on par with other domains, right? It's not an equal mint, but we need to be at least prepared for that. So it's not a weak spot that potential adversaries could take advantage of. But at the same time, we want to unify. There's all the services rely on space capabilities. So not everything that goes with its service does with space will move over to Space Force. And we'll talk through that in the question and answer session if you've got it. That's still a moving, that's still being written out, if you will. So that's where we're at. Like I said, we need to treat space as we would air, land, and sea, because unfortunately our past approaches are really no longer sufficient. So